And we're going to start recording now. So for our seminar today, Ayo is going to bring with us a short history of Latinx racialization. But prior to that, as we all know within our office, if you have gone to our event, we love to honor the sacred land that we inhabit. So I will read the land and labor acknowledgement. Local indigenous people, including the Yokuts and Miwok, who understand the earth as a place for everyone, first inhabited the land where UC Merced is located. When we address diversity on this campus, we do so boldly, daring to look forward and backwards, imagining diversity's demand for the 21st century, and the importance of diversity in addressing past wrongs, reaffirming humanity, and ensuring a reconciliatory path of redress for the future. The most prominent path on our campus is called Scholars Lane, and by day you can see, hear, and witness the embodiment of our diversity through our campus community members making their way across campus framed by the slopes and peaks of the Sierra Nevada, right? And so part of that reflection also is our intent to disrupt and dismantle colonialism beyond this point, but also part of that is for us as a collective with IO seminars, right, up to this point, to really think about how we shift and move the needle of equity and justice in our own campus. Part of it also to guide us in our time together, our community guidelines. So when we look at that, part of it is shared airspace, one DVEX, one mic, right? And we really want you all to engage. This is a lot of information to process, but again, for us to ask the question, right? And also to challenge us like, hey, I already know this information, Onar, but for that is, I want to challenge you on how you can take it further in terms of action, in terms of the thought process, and again shifting or reconstructing and addressing past wrongs. The process, whether at home or in the chat or in discussion. I know some folks have reached out to me in having small groups conversation. That is still the invite. Let me know. And again, the goal for us for this seminar, on the 7th seminar, is to bring the reflection back to our daily practice that will drive session 7, which I'm excited for. That's happening the first week of December. So that's all I have. And I'll read a little bit of Ayo's bio for you all and for those who are joining us for the first time. And so Ayo Magwood, Uprooting, Inequity, LLC is an educational consultant specializing in in-depth evidence-based education on the history, economics, sociology, and cognitive psychology of structural racism. She also equips institutions with the tools and the strategies to foster more productive conversation about racism using her perspective consciousness approach. Her pro-equity model is a K-12 instructional approach for teaching an inclusive and critical honest curriculum that also fosters perspective consciousness, civic skills, and dispositions. And as shared, we identity. Shared a we identity, sorry. She has over 10 years of classroom experience in both majority low-income Black Latino charter schools and majority high-income white private schools. Ayo has a BA in economics and international relations from Brown University and a Master of Science in applied economics from Cornell. So again, let's give a round of applause for Ayo. And Ayo, it's
Great, thank you so much.
Thank you.
So this 4th workshop is on short history of Latinx racialization. So I will define racialization a little bit later on when we start getting into that. But basically, do you remember if you saw my first workshop, it was a history, but it wasn't a history of Blacks in terms of this happened, Black people, this happened, and this happened, this event, but rather I was tracing the history of the evolution or construction of the Black race and the white race, right? So this is the equivalent. So I'm going to trace the history of a Latinx race or identity. okay, through time. So I'm not going to be going through every single event that happened. We can read a history book on that. I'm taking it, I'm seeing how the identity of the people or the race of Latinx evolved. Okay. And also, by the way, this is my very first time presenting this. So it's not as practiced as some of my other workshops. I created it just for you guys. So, and I would love feedback on it. So the logistics and expectations are the same. So please write your clarifying questions in the chat and someone will communicate them to me. I will not check the chat until breaks, but feel free to communicate with other participants. The material, as always, is dense and complex, so I strongly encourage you to use active learning strategies such as note-taking, asking questions, and discussing rather than just listening, which is passive learning. Please take notes. If you choose to take notes, I encourage you to do so. Please do so in the Word doc that's linked. I'm going to show you in a second. And I just want to you know that I just updated that Word doc. So the outline, if you already downloaded the outline, you're going to have to re-download it because it's only, the new one's only been up there for, I don't know, 30 minutes. So it's also in the chat. And by the way, Onar or somebody, could somebody re-drop it in the chat? And the link. And please share your thoughts in the chat when I request. This allows us to hear all voices in the room and not just those who are speaking up. And we're going to have 3 2-minute brain breaks like we did last time. And each brain break will consist of 30 seconds to rest our brain and 90 seconds for active processing in our notes. And in fact, we'll have one, a fourth one right at the end of the discussion. I'm sorry, the presentation. And this is what I'm going to show you at the end of the presentation. I'm going to show this slide. So after a brain break, I'm going to ask you to share your thoughts and takeaways in the chat. So I'm just giving you a heads up. So you're forewarned, okay? I'm going to ask everybody to share their thoughts and takeaways in the chat. We would like 100% participation. And then we'll open it up to verbal discussion. Please limit comments to 1 minute. I told you I would show you, this is what the new outline looks like. Again, it's only half an hour old, so you may have to download it. And this is where you find it. It's also in the chat, but this is where they're normally located. So we're in seminar 4, and there's the agenda notes. You can download it from right there. And just a reminder to really encourage you to take notes and not just to listen, because we remember, we understand and remember much more of what we actively engage in. We don't really retain much of what we hear and see. So far we've talked about the history of the Black race, right? And history of anti-Black racism. So now we're going to talk about, we're going to do a short history of Latinx racialization, and next time, Asian American racialization. Just a short note, I am probably going to go back and forth between saying Latinx and Latino, partly because I'm just getting used to Latinx. It's relatively new. Also because I have found that and we're going to see some data, not all Latino or Latinx people agree or like the term. And also because my sources that I'm using, they all use Latino, most of them, because the Latinx is relatively new. It hasn't entered it hasn't affected the academic, the data or the academic sources yet. Okay, so I'm going to be going back and forth. So our agenda for today, and this is also where you can double check to make sure your outline is the same one we're working with, is first I'm going to just do an overview of some basic data of the Latinx community. Where are Latinx located over the map of the United States? What are the different ethnic origins, et cetera, things, just basic data from the census data. And then we're going to go into our subject, which is a short history of Latinx racialization. I will define racialization, and then we're going to look at how the idea or the race or the ethnicity or the identity of Latinx has developed over time through many layers. So layer 1 would be under Spanish colonial rule. Layer 2 would be post-independent Latin America. Layer 3 would be under United States colonialism. And layer 4 would be Latinx racialization in the United States. So during each of those historical period, they had an effect on how Latinos are viewed and how Latinos view themselves. Okay, that's basically what racialization is. Okay, so let's start with the overview. And after each section, we're going to do that brain break. Okay, so here we have US population by race and Hispanic origin. So officially, at least for now, it's probably going to change, but since about 1980, Hispanic or Latino has been an ethnicity rather than a race. So the Hispanic category in the census actually includes many races. That it's probably going to change, but that's again, the data is still reflecting that. But you can see that Hispanics make up about almost 20% of the population. And it's the after white, it's the next largest population in the United States after white. And the percent of the share of Hispanics, you notice in all the data, as you guys have filled out a census form, you know that the population is listed as Hispanics in the data. I normally don't use that term at all, but I'm going to use it while describing the data because that's how the data was collected. Okay, so you'll see that the share of Hispanics has been growing, and both nationally and also specifically for California. So now by 2020, now the Hispanics are now the largest racial or ethnic group in California. In 2020, you can see that the share of whites dropped, and so did the share of Blacks and the share of Asians and Hispanics. Has been increasing over the last decade or two, and same thing nationally. And it's part, and also you can see here the Hispanic population, and in general the non-white population total is expected to grow, and whites are expected to be in the minority by roughly 2045. Relatively, that's not too far down the line from now. The increase is coming mostly from internal population growth, from U.S. births rather than immigration. You can see over time, the more yellowish is to the right is immigration, and the more orange brownish is U.S. births. And you can see that immigration has been dropping. It increased for a while, and then it's been dropping lately. And so most of the growth is from U.S. residents. And here is, we can see the U.S. Hispanic population by county for the United States. So you can see there's a large concentration in the Southwest, which is, of course, natural because we stole this land from Mexico. So Mexican Americans were in here, aside from immigrants. There were Mexican Americans who have been here since this area was part of the United States, right? So before that, sorry. And you can see there's also population, Washington and the North Chicago, Northeast, and Florida. And we're gonna, and that's where you guys are. Okay, we're right there in that concentration. And so we can compare where Hispanics are located to where Blacks are located. Of course, Blacks are located in the areas where they used to have, where used to keep enslaved people, where they kidnapped and used enslaved people to work the agricultural fields, cotton and tobacco. So you see a big concentration in the Southeast, in the South there, and there's of course some migration to the north as well, and some out to the west. Here's the Asian American population, and it's a little bit somewhat similar to the Hispanic where the Hispanic population is growing, and there is the American Indian or Native American population. Again, I'm using the terms that the census uses. And again, like I want to point out that, of course, it's important to note that that southwest area used to be part of Mexico. So it actually, again, there were Latinx people and people who spoke Spanish even before English was spoken, long before English was spoken, and long before the first Anglos arrived. And that's where you guys are. Okay, and so again, all this area where you see that huge, large concentration of Latinx community, particularly Mexican Americans, Chicanos, used to be part of Mexico. This is a map of Mexico in 1836, and you can see. So we took so Texas was first stolen away first, and then in the quote unquote Mexican American War was New Mexico and California. The California entered immediately, was annexed immediately because, of course, the very next year, gold was discovered, and a rush of Anglos rushed to California. Well, also Asians and Blacks, but the white Anglo population quickly overrun California, and so they were happy, and plus of the gold, they were happy to bring it in, and Texas as well. But the New Mexico area was majority Latino, and so that remained a colony for 64 years. They did not accept it into the United States until it was majority white. It had become majority Anglo, and that's where you guys are. And of course, this area that was taken from Mexico, some Chicanos refer to it as Aztlan, the promised land for Chicanos. And I don't know if you have ever seen this ad from Absolute Vodka. They have a series of ads where they say "in an absolute world." So this is one of them. I always found it amusing. So 63% of Latinx are of Mexican origin, and almost 10% are of Puerto Rican origin. So this makes perfect sense. So again, there were many Mexican Americans in the country when we took the land, and also Mexico's a border. And of course, Puerto Rico is part of the United States. Puerto Ricans are American citizens and can freely come and go as they please. So it makes sense that the two largest Latinx populations are Mexican and Puerto Rican. And of course, Salvador, Cuba, Dominican Republic also are close by. In addition to push and pull factors, there's also just geographic proximity, right? And there's different, there tends to be different ethnicities in different areas. So for example, there's several different areas with a lot of people, Latinx of Mexican origin, but there's a concentration there. And then, and also in California and Texas, Puerto Ricans are concentrated in New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut area, and also some in Florida. Salvadoran population, many in the DC, Virginia metro area, and Cubans in the Miami. And I did not know this before, but apparently there's a big population of Hondurans in New Orleans. The Latino populations in US metro areas are more diverse along the East Coast. So you can see in California and Texas, it's mostly Mexican origin, but in Northeast, there's much more diversity among Latinos. I don't know if you want to see that for a few seconds. Among this U.S. citizen share among Hispanic origin groups, so Guatemalans and Hondurans had among the lowest shares of U.S. citizens, and part of that is politics, and we'll talk about that later. But a lot of this, a major factor into the percentage, the share of citizens versus residents and undocumented have to do with politics and the United States relationships with that country that allow them to be more or less flexible. The reason, by the way, Puerto Rican is only 99% is because they were counting some Puerto Ricans who have been born elsewhere, meaning not the United States, not Puerto Rico. And in terms of income levels, it's a wide variety, wide differences in income shares. South Americans tend to have higher income, average income, household income than, for example, Central Americans and Puerto Ricans. In terms of primary language, it's pretty obvious that first generation is going to be more Spanish dominant, and second or third generation is going to be less and less Spanish dominant, more English dominant. 3 in 10 Hispanic newlyweds married someone who is not Hispanic, and in fact, Hispanics have the slightly just beat out Asians as the ethnic group that is most marrying outside of their ethnic or racial group. And then there's pretty big increase. And most Hispanics are identifying as either other or multiple race. And that is because it was in 1980, it was actually Hispanics who advocated for adding Hispanic into the census. So the people who were creating the census did not want to make it a race because they wanted to make sure that the racial data was continuous. Because from anyone who's doing research or looking at the data, you have to have continuity from census to census. So they didn't want to have a break in how the races were defined. So that was part of the reason why it was made into an ethnicity rather than a race. But that is changing right now. So it's because so many, despite writing down as Hispanics, it's clear that Latinos or Latinx see it as a race, because white, blacks, and Asians almost never select other, but Hispanics, a very high percentage of Hispanics choose either multiple race or other, indicating that they don't feel white or black or American Indian or Asian. They feel they see their identity as a race, and so there's a movement to change that in the census. So 2/3 of Hispanic adults say being Hispanic is part of their racial background. So 19% considered as an ethnic, as ethnicity, 11% considered a race, and 56% considered it both a race and a ethnic background. As we've talked about this before, identity is constantly changing. We can really see this, not just identity, race. So race and identity are constantly evolving, they're dynamic, and we can really see that here. And the Latinx term is pretty new. So 76%, this was a couple of years ago, had never heard of Latinx. And of them who have heard of it, it's a very small percentage that prefers to use it. And you can see more women like the Latinx term and more educated people like the term. But again, things are changing rapidly. So these are a couple years old. It could be, if we did the survey again today, may have a different answer. Okay, we're gonna take our first break. Okay, and I'm gonna time now 90 seconds. No.
Yep, you're set.
Okay, so now we're gonna get into the meat of our presentation. We're gonna look at the historical evolution of Latinx identity, race, ethnicity, group. So I've been greatly influenced by this amazing book by Laura Gomez. She's a professor of law at UCLA. So in your system, and the book is called "Inventing Latinos: A New Story of American Racism." So I read several other books, and I also have a lot of prior knowledge, but I'd say an essential part of it. She provided an essential part of it, and I want to make sure I identify that. So racialization can be defined as how society and the state assign individuals to racial groups and the relative position of those groups to each other. And I would also say, like what that race means, what that racial group, what the stereotypes and that associated to it as well. What does it mean to be Black? What does it mean to be white? What does it mean to be Latinx? Okay, so we're going to explore how that has evolved over time. And again, remember, race is constantly evolving. So same with Latinx. Again, I'm going to quote from Professor Gomez. We now turn to examining racism toward and racialization of Latinos, but we must do so by seeking to understand the legacy of 4 layers of white supremacy, some of them overlapping in time. The first one was the racialization of Latinx under Spanish colonial rule in Latin America. The second one was the racialization that was going on after independence from Spain, post-independent Latin America. The third was under American colonial rule in Latin America. And the fourth phase or layer is in terms of racialization in the United States. Okay, so that's a quote from her book from the introduction. So first, let's look at racialization of Latinx under Spanish colonial rule, going back in time. So we remember that we've learned that that race in the British colonies was seen as, especially we focused on white versus Black because we were on the East Coast and there weren't a lot of Native Americans. But more nationally, a little bit later on, we could think of race in the British colonies as being white, Native American, and Black. And Native American, and it depends, depending on the time and the place, sometimes Native Americans were considered a little bit just like a half step above Blacks. But you can notice that it's very much a binary or trinary, okay? Just a very few boxes, right, of races. Now, and I also want to point out, because it's important to our story, that the roles that Blacks and Native Americans played in Anglo-white American, the white supremacist society. So historian Seth Rockman has this brilliant journal article called "Liberty is the Land and Slaves, the Great Contradiction." He wrote, "It was not just a coincidence that some people in 19th century America had liberty, while others did not. Rather, some people's liberty depended upon the denial of liberty to others. The liberty that offered prosperity to Southern white men required expansive oppression, both the violent appropriation of millions of acres of frontier land from the Native American people who possessed them, and the violent enslavement of millions of African Americans whose labor would transform these lands into profitable plantations." See, that's why he calls it liberty is land and slaves. And that's the role that Native Americans and Black people played. So liberty for some was made possible by oppression for others. So going back to here, so Native Americans, whites needed their land and they needed their labor, okay? So that's with British Americans and also 19th century United States. And we also learned, other thing we learned is that that in the British colonies, they made race into a binary. They forced it into a binary boxes, like 2 boxes. Sometimes it was 3 with mulatto, but basically it was 2 boxes with using laws, remember? So, and that by the way, that practice is called hypo descent. So that means that mixed race children are assigned to the socially inferior race. So it means that you don't have any mixed race categories, unlike, for instance, in Latin America or in South Africa or a lot of places. There's no mixed race categories. And it also means that it's not like you can sometimes go white and sometimes go Black. The mixed race children are always assigned to the socially inferior race. Okay, so that's how race was in the mainland British America. So how was race constructed in Spanish America? So you might have learned in school that they had the casta system. It's not quite true. It's mostly just a painting, but it does give you an idea that there was a lot more mixing going on, and there was a lot more variations, and that was partly because of demographic factors. So in the British colonists, they went with their whole family. So yes, there was some mixing, but they did have white Anglo women with them. The Spanish and Portuguese went mostly solo. So that means that they were intermarrying a lot more with the local population. There was other reasons as well, and then also there was more, you saw, for instance, in Virginia and in the East Coast, we had completely wiped out the Native Americans. But in many places in Latin America, and there was all three, white, blacks, and Native Americans. So there was a lot more mixing in. And also you can see that there's a lot more gradations in the mixed race people. They're not hypo descent. They're not becoming black or Indian. They're becoming their own race. You see that? So there's many races. Again, this is a bit of an exaggeration. Oh, by the way, here's a close-up, for example, in case you've never seen this. And so supposedly mulatto, which is half black, half white, with a Spanish person, the child is called morisco. And then supposedly a morisco with a Spanish woman would be a chino, etc. Again, it turned out to be mostly it's a bit of exaggeration. The reality, their racial structure was more like this. But still, you can see it is more complex. There's more categories than with race in the British colonies. Let's see. I'm not sure about French colonial rule. I'm seeing a question in the chat. I am not sure. I know Spanish and Portuguese very much. I'm not really familiar with the French. I'll find out and tell you next time. But still, it was more. You can see it's more complicated, right? You can see that there's more mixing is one thing, right? And the second thing is when they did mix, they often created a new category. If nothing else, mestizo. Mestizo is mixed, is mixed, basically a fancy word, Spanish word for mixed, right? So that's important to keep in mind, okay? But you notice they're still both white supremacists, right? And you notice that the blacks and indigenous people are still on the bottom on both places, okay? So just keep that in mind. But still, okay. So that's under Spanish colonial rule that is already influencing. And so for example, everybody from Latin America, meaning immigrants, the first generation immigrants, as opposed to the Latinx who were born in the United States, but everybody, all the first generation, they're going to still be influenced by these categories. And for example, they would see themselves as mestizo or mulatto rather than black or white, okay? So this is one layer. Let's go on to the next layer, is post-independent Latin America. And after that, we'll have a break. So under Spanish colonialism, we find that as we saw, we had the white supremacist racial structure with several mixed races, right? Okay. Now, what happened after independence? And that is they sort of divided into two big groups. So, in nations that, and I'm going to give you some examples in a second, in nations where the population was majority white versus Latin American nations where the population was majority mixed race, basically mestizo or mulatto. And I'm sure you're wondering, so what's the cutoff point? The cutoff point basically was, did the white elites, did they have enough numbers and power to be able to win independence by themselves, is basically what it came down to. Versus did they need to ally with the mestizos in the population in order to fight against the Spaniards to get their independence. That's basically what it came down to. For example, Colombia was sort of like on the line. They have a fairly big white population. Their first attempt at independence failed because it was all white. And so they had to come back and ally with the mestizo population and come back the second time. And the second time they won. Okay, so that's sort of the dividing point. So let's look first at the population where the countries where there's majority white. In those countries, post-independence developed national ideology that privileged whites. And because of that, in those countries, the racial structure, they ended up having more like racial categories because basically everybody wanted to be white because white was normative and privileged. And so they tended to have more white and black. It's not exactly like the United States, but I would call it like a modified racial category. And here are some examples. Can you see here? So the countries that fall in that category are Argentina, Chile, Uruguay, Costa Rica, southern Brazil.
I'm thinking that sorry, go ahead, put it away. I'm thinking that it's hard to understand why it's always a problem. You know?
Definitely. I know. But I mean, that's just how.
Are you talking to me, or is
but I believe
that intentional, or
can we check on that?
Yeah, can you mute everybody, please? I don't think they were talking to me. I think they were just.
Yeah, everyone's muted.
Which means I have to unmute.
Okay. Versus countries that were majority mestizo, or at least, you know, you needed to have a coalition of whites and mestizos in order to win independence. Of course, they couldn't have they couldn't have white ideology, right? Because they were beholden to the mestizo population who had helped win independence. So they developed national ideologies of mestizaje. Of course, Mexico is the most famous, right? The raza cósmica, the cosmic race, and where they privileged mestizos or mixed race, or glorified mestizos or mixed race. And those countries developed more of a racial spectrum. I'm going to show you an example, but they didn't have the clear-cut boxes, right? So it's not clear who counts as white or not. And mestizo and mixed race is normative and glorified. But you notice that in both systems, Blacks and Indigenous are marginalized and discriminated against. But are whites at the top, or is mestizo at the top is the big difference. And these countries include Mexico, of course, Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, and northern Brazil. And again, the first generation Latinx are going to be influenced by these ideas, by the ideology of their home country. So I told you I'd show you an example, and you may recognize this because this is from my first seminar, if you saw it. So again, most Latin American countries can be divided into two. Those that have racial categories or races, right, boxes. These are societies that have histories of whiteness ideology, and that also had used laws to racially classify. So United States and Canada has a very clear binary. You're either white or black. And these other Latin American countries, again, I told you it was like a modified category, racial categories. So they do have a mixed race middle category, but you notice that it's sort of left over, like most people are either white or black. Because in this country, because whiteness is important, everybody wants to be white. So anybody who can kind of sort of get away with it claims that they're white, because that's the only way you can advance in that society, socially or economically. Versus in countries like Colombia, Mexico, Ecuador, Peru, northern Brazil, because they have an ideology of mestizaje, you know, that's celebrated, then it's acceptable and normative to be mestizo and pardo. So only people who are very, very light-skinned get called white or consider themselves white, and only people who are very dark-skinned consider themselves black. And so we call this a racial spectrum. So the boxes aren't as clear. It's more, again, like colorism, more of a spectrum. I mean, there's definitely discrimination, but it's more like gradual, you know, rather than jumping from one box to the other. And you notice, of course, that the same skin color that's considered white in some countries is considered not white or mestizo in some other countries, and the same skin color that's considered black in these countries is considered mestizo and not black in other countries because of this. So of course, first generation Latinx some of them are coming from, you know, the countries with racial categories, and some of them are coming with countries that are racial spectrums, right? So they're coming in with different conceptions of race, right? Very, very different conceptions of race. They're coming to the United States, which is in that first category, right? So just to give more detail on that. So here is a spectrum of skin colors. So we're going to take the researchers took this skin color right here. Okay, it's kind of in the gray area, and these are many of the countries in Latin America. And the question is, this is the percent of persons with that number 4 light brown skin color that identify as white. Okay, so in the countries that have racial categories, remember, these are countries with history of whiteness ideology. Most identify as either Black or white, and a wide spectrum of light skin colors is considered white. So that is these countries here: Chile, Costa Rica, Uruguay, and Argentina. You can see that most people with that skin color consider themselves white. Versus these other countries, you see that it's a pretty big jump, right? There's a pretty big jump between, for instance, Chile and Brazil, right? In these countries where mestizaje is celebrated, that color is not considered white. It's considered mestizo, okay? So again, you have Latinx people come to the United States, the first generation, with very different conceptions of race and of skin color. There's Mexico, by the way, I'm pointing out because, of course, you know, what was it, 64% of Latinx are of Mexican origin, and so they would definitely not consider that white. And you can see a little bit of a pattern in the way Latinx from people from different ethnic origins or identity identify. So the blue is those who identify as other, and the orange is those that identify as white. And I have put them in a row from the lowest percentage. Dominicans have the lowest rate of identifying as white, to Cubans have the highest identification of as white. So of course, some of it is actual skin color, right? So people from these countries tend to vary in skin tone, but as we can see, it's not just the actual skin tone, it's also the interpretation of that skin tone, right? That's being layered on top of it. So for South America, you know, 70%. Again, we know that that is partly because South Americans tend to be lighter skinned, but it's also partly because how they identify, what they think of, what skin colors they think of as white. And by the way, the Dominican is a little bit different. It's a little unusual because what they'll do is to try to, a lot of them look like me, right? They're pretty brown skinned, but they try to distance themselves from their African or Black roots by claiming, they use a term called Indio. It's considered disparaging for instance, in Mexico, but they use it to mean basically not Black. It's their way of saying I'm brown, but I'm not Black. My skin may be brown skin, but I am not Black. That's their way of distancing themselves from Blackness. Okay, so that I promised, like I said, we would take a break.
Okay, we're good to go.
Okay, and I just saw a chat. It's not race, the mestizaje, yeah, that is I'm going to address that. There's a couple of questions about mestizaje. It's complicated. On one hand, it's supposed to be, it's a repudiation of the Northern American idea that mixing race, mongrels were inferior, right? So in addition to Blacks and Native Americans being inferior, mixed race people were not just inferior because they were partly Black or partly indigenous, but also the fact that they were impure, the fact that they were mongrels. There was this deep sense of inferiority about that. So in one ways, it was a repudiation of the white supremacy, because it's saying it was a celebration and glorification of not being white, right? Of being mixed race, of being mestizos are usually a combination of Spanish origin, heritage, and Indian heritage, sometimes a little bit of Black mixed in. So which is, for example, the majority of Mexico. And so in one way, it was a repudiation of white, but in another ways, it was kind of like a distorted version of white supremacy, because in that glorification of mixed race, they were still discriminating against and marginalizing Blacks and indigenous people. And in fact, the idea is that the mestizaje would assimilate, that indigenous people would assimilate and become better, right? Mestizo meaning leave their indigenous roots. So it was also indirectly, if you look at it on its face, it seems like a great thing, but if you look a little bit closer, you realize that it's in another way just as damaging. It's sort of like the next person on the totem pole is sort of discriminating against and marginalizing the people at the bottom is still getting marginalized and discriminated. Does that help? And I think that was an important question. So does that help? Okay, great. We are now, the layer 3 would be under United States colonization. Okay. Again, I'm going to quote from her book, and this is a longer quote. If for African Americans, the fundamental racial origin story is one of capture in Africa, forced travel to North America, and brutal enslavement itself protected by law, then what is the defining race-making crucible of Latinos? The clear answer is that it begins with American colonialism and empire in Latin America, including Mexico, right? Whether in order to extend the country to the Pacific, Mexico, taking 1/3 of Mexico, or to extract resources like coffee, sugar, or banana in Puerto Rico, Cuba, Guatemala, Honduras, and Costa Rica, or to connect the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans, Panama, Nicaragua, or to achieve America's manifest destiny in the hemisphere, all of the above countries, or to provide access to an exploitable labor force, again, all the countries. The United States has invaded, annexed, covertly and overtly interfered and governed its way across Latin America for 2 centuries. The linkages between America's overt and sometimes covert interventions in Mexico, the Caribbean, and Central America, and the migration of those people northward from those regions connects with how Latinos experience racial oppression today. The result was uniformly the displacement of peasants and workers in those countries, such that migration to the United States was preordained. Once here, most first and second generation Latinos have toiled in the lowest paying, least skilled jobs in the agriculture, construction, service, and manufacturing sectors. Just as Sivanandan expressed about Britain, colonialism and migration are on the same continuum in the United States, just like in Britain. In other words, we are here because you were there. I thought that was pretty powerful. And you're welcome to use it in class. So, but again, when I want to talk about colonialism, it's important to understand that colonialism didn't start with Cuba and Puerto Rico, right? It started with Texas and Mexico, right? And in fact, like I said, Texas and California entered the United States pretty quickly. New Mexico was a form of a colony for a good 64 years. In other words, a lot of Chicanos or Mexican Americans say, we didn't cross the border crossed us. So for example, and a lot of people just, that Latinx are sort of disappeared from from westward, the history of the West. But in fact, did you guys know this? 1 in 3 Cowboys were Latinx. I mean, it made sense. So even though Cowboys are glorified in the movies and popular culture, they were basically low-skilled labor that was being used on the farms and in agriculture. So it was often, in fact, most of them were low-income people, both Blacks and Latinos and Latinx. But of course, they get, every time you see a picture of a cowboy, they're always white, right? So you remember that, so the question was, at that point, once we had taken over 1/3 of Mexican land, we now had a huge population of Mexican Americans. So the question is, how do we fit them into our racial hierarchy? Are they Native Americans? Are they Blacks? Because of course, we took over that land both for the Mexican land and their labor. So in a way, they were a combination, right? So it took a long time of negotiating to try to figure out how Mexican Americans, or at that point, it was only Mexican Americans. I'm not using it as a synonym for Latinx. So the question was, how do Mexican Americans fit into the United States racial structure? What race are Mexican Americans? Eventually, we sort of came up with this system where they were considered sort of a buffer race. Still Black, as you can see, still non-white, very, very clearly non-white, very discriminated against, very marginalized, but they were considered slightly, half step above both Native Americans and Blacks. And this was socially, legally, actually, legally, Mexican Americans were considered white, but that was purely for political reasons. It had to do with, it's a long story, but it has to do with slavery. It had to do with slavery, but that was just on paper. And it was, like I said, it was for political reasons only. But in reality, socially, Mexican Americans were considered sort of a buffer zone. And that was, they played a very important part in maintaining this racial hierarchy and keeping Native Americans and Blacks below. You needed that buffer zone to make it very clear cut, to protect the white race. And also, like I said, I think it's interesting that we needed Mexican Americans for both their land and labor. There we go. So part of it had to do with manifest destiny, right? So you may be familiar with this painting. Anglo-white Americans were convinced that it was Anglo-white Americans' destiny to take over the entire land from sea to sea. So you can see on the one side, on the right, it's the East Coast, and then you can see it's ocean to ocean on both sides. And you can see that they're moving westward, and they're bringing light with them. They're bringing light, they're bringing God, and they're bringing communications, technology, and the book represents not just education, but learning and knowledge, intelligence, and that they're bringing that to, and you notice on the left, you notice it's dark, and you notice there's Native Americans, animals, and wilderness. And that it was really providence, that it was God-given. God had promised them to give them this land because they were superior to Native Americans and Mexicans and Blacks, and because it was their destiny. So this is an important part of imperialism. And in fact, that's what imperialism was. Basic imperialism is just extending manifest destiny from just spreading it beyond those oceans, right? It's going a little bit further into, you can see on the right is Puerto Rico and Cuba, and then on the left is the Philippines and Hawaii. The Anglos really saw imperialism as just an extension of manifest destiny. And again, it was tied in not just with that it was their destiny, but also was very closely tied with race and with they were convinced of the superiority of their race. And in fact, this is a political cartoon from 1899. It's shortly after the United States has colonized. You see right here, the United States is a teacher in a school. And here in the front are Philippines, Hawaii, Puerto Rico, and Cuba. Okay, you can see they're very dark skinned, right? They're all basically Black. They're very racialized, right? That was part of the reason. I don't know if you remember from my first workshop, I said we had to decide whether the Filipinos or Puerto Ricans and Cubans and Hawaiians were Black or white, because if they were white, we couldn't justify colonizing them. But because they were Black, we could justify colonizing them. So race is a very important part of it. We have racialized Cubans and Hawaiians. And by the way, that represents Black. That guy back there is the Black person. He's can't even attend the school. And there's the Native American. Also, you notice all the non-whites are very dark. And he has his book upside down. And the Chinese immigrant also can't enter the classroom. But very much, you can see the white versus non-white. Okay, and the new colonies are pictured not just as Black, but also petulant children, right? And then they also they tried to convince the world and themselves that they were doing this to help, right? So they were helping the Filipinos escape from Spanish oppression, and they were helping Hawaiians to escape from industrial slavery. They were helping Puerto Ricans and Cubans to escape from the Spanish yoke. And you know, that it's very much this idea is often called white man's burden. It comes from a poem by Rudyard Kipling, who also wrote The Jungle Book. But it's the idea that white British and Americans have the responsibility, because they're superior in race, they have the responsibility of helping all of the other non-white peoples, but that it's this huge burden. Okay, so you can see that that's the person in the middle of the red coat is representing Britain. He's bringing his colonies, and here on the right there's Uncle Sam, and he's bringing his colonies, including Hawaii and Cuba and Puerto Rico and the Philippines. And you see that they're carrying them above, over the rocks of ignorance and oppression and superstition and cannibalism and cruelty and vice and ignorance to civilization. And okay, and even when they used Panama, they backed the Panamanian Revolution in exchange for a right to build a canal across Panama. You can see what's the word, infantilizing, right? The attitude of Americans. And also want to point out that the American, we often think of, when we're in the U.S. history classroom, when we study U.S. colonialism or U.S. imperialism, we're only talking about the turn of the century. We're only talking about Cuba and the Philippines and Puerto Rico. But you can see that we never stopped, right? The entire history has been intervention after intervention into intervention, including occupations, right? For a long time, major significant interventions that were which resulted in extreme economic and political upheaval, which of course fed the migration, right? So that, and also this is just in our neighborhood, but of course in all of Latin America, right? We've had tons and tons of military interventions, which have helped create tons of economic and political upheaval. So again, repeat, just as Sivanandam expressed about Britain, colonialism and migration are likewise on the same continuum for the United States. We are here because you were there. And also because of that, the migration, or at least the applications for visas for immigration and for asylum, are often very politically motivated and have to do with the United States' interest in those countries. So for example, these are asylum applications that were approved between 1983 and 1991 in Central America. And you notice a far more significant number of Nicaraguans and Cubans were admitted than Salvadorans and Guatemalans. And that is because the upheaval in Nicaragua and Cuba were done by socialist regimes that the United States was against, versus the upheaval in political and genocide and political upheaval that was happening in El Salvador and Guatemala were happening by regimes that we were backing and funding. So we could not admit asylum seekers from there, because that would be admitting that we were doing wrong. Should I do another break? I feel like I just did a break. Should we just continue? Cynthia, what do you think?
I'm still catching up with your last comment. It's the
sorry.
Yes, this.
Yeah. You need to take a break?
I would love to hear this one again, if you can.
I'll leave it on here. Yep, no problem.
Thank you. Question to you, Ayo. Can you repeat that relationship between, you just mentioned, by doing something you would be admitting the guilt? Can you just run that one more time?
Yes. So why do people seek asylum? They seek asylum because there's extreme conditions in their country that make the country unlivable, right? That you cannot live there. because usually it's either because of natural disaster, which wasn't the case, or because the country's government is committing genocide, or is messing up the country, or is killing people, or is creating political and economic upheaval, and that is why you are seeking asylum in another country. So, but the problem was the governments that were creating this political and economic upheaval and genocide in El Salvador and Guatemala were directly and significantly funded, supported, and aided by the U.S. government. So if by the United States admitting asylum applications from El Salvador to Guatemala, that means that you agree that the economic and political conditions in El Salvador and Guatemala are bad enough that you count as a refugee.
Yeah. Okay.
The United States could not admit that, because they would have to admit that we were pouring tons of money and military aid to prop up governments, regimes that were creating, political and economic upheaval, leading to masses of political refugees coming to the United States. So we could not admit that politically.
Whereas in Nicaragua
and Cuba, of course, those countries, the United States hated, right? They were quote unquote socialist. So we had no problem admitting that we're like, oh yes, you account as an asylum seeker. We agree that there's the significant political and economic upheaval to the point where you cannot live there, that you need to seek asylum somewhere else. Stamp, you're allowed in. But of course, there's the same thing happening in all four nations. But depending on whether we back the government or not, that determined whether your asylum application got accepted. It's 100% political.
Wow. And this resonates so much with what's happening currently.
Yeah, you see variations. Now, I have to admit, this was caught. So there was a court case. It was called the ABC something. It was ABC Church or something. So a court case came, and they got caught. It was so clear cut. They had to admit fault. The federal government had to admit fault, and then they had to go back and adjust and let in. They made a special visa application for Salvadorans and Guatemalans. I remember some of my students, I helped them apply for it because they were like, okay, fine, and so there was suddenly they accepted a bunch of Salvadorans and Guatemalans because they were forced to. But of course, variations of this happen all the time, right? Why is it that some country in some countries you can get accepted and others don't? And a lot of times it has to do with politics, and sometimes it has to do with race. Why do we not admit Haitians? Hello?
Yeah.
Right? It should be that each person gets accepted based on the actual need, the actual level of political and economic upheaval. But a lot of times it has to do with politics. It goes back to our intervention, United States intervention and colonialism and imperialism in those countries, and our political and economic needs in those countries, and also race. So so this really shows us even more so how colonialism, what was that phrase again? How colonialism and migration really are on the same continuum. Not only is the colonialism causing tons of people to leave their country to come to the United States, but then it also influences our gatekeeping of that immigration.
Ooh, Ayo.
Yeah. Oof.
So it sounds like we definitely need a 2-minute break. Would you rather me keep up this slide or the next slide?
Either or. I think it's a good moment to stretch.
Okay. I'm gonna do my 2-minute timer.
Okay, I'm stopping the recording.
The recording. Okay. So now we're gonna move on to Latinx racialization in the United States, which is the fourth layer. But of course, remember, it's layering on top of all those other layers, right? Just keep that in mind. So there's a couple of different origins of basically racism, anti-Latinx racism in the United States. One is the beliefs in ethnic citizenship versus civic citizenship. So technically, the United States has civic citizenship. So civic citizenship means that everyone is an American. Everyone who believes in the values, who agrees to support the values, the common values of the United States, is a citizen, regardless of their race or ethnicity. Technically, that's true on paper, right? But in some ways, in some people's minds, we have ethnic citizenship, meaning to be an American is to be white or Anglo, right? You can see this. Like even in our minds, right? Even in our minds, those of us who are non-white, if we say, even somebody says, think of an American, what do we think of? We think of a white person, right? In many ways, our ideas of who we think of, who is really an American, is really tied with whiteness. So in that way, even though we technically have civic citizenship, in a way we have ethnic citizenship, or maybe even racial citizenship. And that affects Blacks and Indigenous people, but it affects Latinx people even more, because not only are Latinx people non-white, but also at least part of the population are immigrants. So I've heard scholars talk about the idea of alien citizens. What that means is that even when Latinx are citizens, in fact, even when they're third and fourth and fifth and sixth generation Americans, in some people's minds, they are never going to be a citizen. They're never going to be a real American. They're going to always be alien citizens. So an alien citizen is someone who's technically a citizen, but in some people's mind is never American. They're always alien. It's like saying a forever foreigner or perpetual foreigner. Asian Americans obviously also struggle with this a lot. So that's one source of anti-Latinx racism in the United States. Another source is colorism. We all know about this, right? And so not only are, and of course it depends on the country of origin. We all know that some Latinx countries have more darker skinned people than others. But also, I don't know if you know this, but in general, immigrants from any part of the world going anywhere in which direction tend to be pretty polarized to the most highly educated and the least highly educated. The people who are in the middle, have middle skills, middle educational level, they can improve their lot better by going to the capital city in their own country. But those who have the highest income, like for instance, college degrees, PhDs, master's degrees, they can maximize, they can improve their life better by going overseas to United States or Europe. And those who have very low skills, very low education, same thing, they can improve their life better by going to the United States or Europe. So that means a disproportionate number of immigrants to the United States tend to be from the low income class of their country, which again, because of racism in their country, are much more likely to be darker skinned. Make sense? And then a third source of anti-Latinx racism in this country is something called the racialization of illegality, or other scholars call it the racialization of legal status. And that's tied to colorism, because somehow when a Canadian is undocumented, somehow it doesn't get racialized. But for certain races, certain skin colors, there's also that the idea of being an illegal is so strong and so powerful. It's almost like it's racialized. And notice that even you don't have to, you can be a citizen, again, you can be second, third, fourth citizen and still experience this. I'm sure you know that, right? So that racialization of illegality gets extended and affects the entire Latinx community, regardless of their individual legal status. And so because of all of that discrimination and marginalization, brown-skinned immigrants, and also, like I said, because again, immigrants in general tend to be either high income or low income. So they also tend to be, have fewer skills, less education, and be browner skinned than their population in their country. So because of all of that, brown-skinned immigrants are more likely to attend poorly funded schools because of racism in this country, receive lower quality education, be undocumented, and hold low skill, low prestige jobs. You notice we're specifically talking about browner skinned immigrants here, okay? That often means we're talking Mexicans. Again, there's tons of Mexicans who are lighter skinned, but the immigrants Mexican immigrants who come to the United States are disproportionately more darker, right? Same thing, Central America, same thing. They're just the ones that come here are disproportionately brown skinned. And this is a problem that we see. The lighter skinned immigrants, including lighter skinned Latinx communities, are less likely to suffer from the alien citizenship, from the colorism, and the racialization of illegality, okay? I'm gonna show you some examples. During the Depression, the Great Depression, the United States, they decided that there wasn't enough jobs to go around because of the Great Depression, and they, quote unquote, repatriated, they're not sure, but at least 1 million Mexican Americans. There was a combination. Some were on a visa, so they weren't Mexican citizens, but there was plenty who were actually Mexican citizens. There were just heartbreaking stories about people who were, quote unquote, repatriated. Patria means country, so repatriated means go back to your country, right? But this included possibly up to 1 million Mexican American citizens, including, for example, people who had zero paperwork for Mexico, people who didn't speak Spanish, or spoke very halting Spanish, but somehow it didn't matter whether they were American citizens, but by being Mexican, they were suddenly alien, right? They're foreign. It doesn't matter how many generations they've been in Mexico, they are still considered foreign, alien. So as soon as we have trouble, we're going to repatriate them to send them back to their country. And I'm sure you've seen that before. And again, it's also up to convenience, right? So here we send back 1 million, entre comillas, I'm sorry, between, in parentheses, in quotation marks. Sorry?
Quotations.
Yes, repatriated. And then noted 1930, 1943, but then suddenly we needed labor, so we turned around. In 1942 and 1964, we had the Mexican Bracero program. All of a sudden we needed Mexican workers. And look at the conditions of how we brought them in, Mexicans in the Bracero program. On the left here, they had to go through these humiliating medical exams, almost as if they were animals. You see on the right, they're actually being fumigated. And on the left, I forgot, they're given a paper towel to cover their private parts. And you can see the conditions that they're being housed in. But also, do you see how quickly that turned to say, I'm going to go back. See, this is 1930, 1943, and this is 1942 to 64. Again, it has so much to do with the needs of the United States, right? And how quickly, oh, now we don't need you, and now you're a foreigner, and and then now, okay, well, you can come in if you just do our labor, but you can't stay. With the Bracero program, it was a temporary program. You can just stay for the seasonal, and then go back. I think it helps speak to that idea of alienness and foreignness, and also goes back to, remember that visa with the Central Americans. It also ties in with that, whatever is convenient for the United States, whatever is political at the internal politics. Here's another way we can see the racialization, especially of browner skinned immigrants like Mexicans. Again, I want to clarify, there's tons of people, not all people in Mexico, not everyone is brown skinned, but again, a disproportionate number of immigrants, Mexican immigrants, are going to be more browner skinned. So these two Latino economists found that there's a third generation disadvantage for Mexican immigrants. So normally the typical story is for immigrants, white immigrants anyhow, is that each generation does better than the rest, right? And by third generation, you become American. That's the typical path, right? But he found that many Mexican immigrant families are much less likely to experience that story. And in fact, they find that the second generation does better than the first generation, which is not too difficult to do. Again, because most Mexican, it's the poorest that are coming in. So the second generation does better. But the third generation is supposed to be better and does not. It gets worse than the second generation. And they attribute that to the racialization of Mexican immigrants. And it has to do with all that things I told you about remember the three things I told you about? The idea of the forever foreigner, you're always an alien, you're never American. The second one was colorism. And the third one was, the aura of illegality. And so here we're going to see it. So this is income levels for age 19 through age 25. Okay. Now that is the trajectory of third generation white immigrants doing pretty well. And then there in the middle is third generation Black immigrant. Okay. Doesn't do as well. Okay. There's second generation Mexican immigrant. They do pretty well. They do better than third generation Black immigrants. Not as well as third generation white immigrants, but it's okay. It's only the second generation, right? So we hope, according to the theory, third generation Mexican immigrants should, if not be, maybe they might not quite be up there where third generation Mexican immigrant is, but they should definitely be above where second generation Mexican immigrant is. But no, the third generation falls. They do worse. They tend to do worse than second generation. And there's only one thing that can explain this. It's the racialization, because the third generation Mexican immigrants becomes a race. It becomes a non-white Mexican or Latinx race, which is considered inferior, and it suffers all that discrimination, the colorism, et cetera. They get labeled, and then the stereotypes, and they get stuck in that. So we already saw this, right? So I'm going to repeat this. So these are the three factors, I think, that are driving anti-Latinx discrimination and racism. One is that belief that a real American is white. There's colorism. And then there's that racialization of illegality. And then on top of that, also, it's like a vicious cycle, because the discrimination means that brown skin immigrants are likely to attend poorly funded schools. If you don't get a good education, same thing as Blacks, right? We saw that. We saw that Black people also very poorly funded schools. And so we have less quality education. If we have less quality, education is supposed to be the engine of mobility. If you can't get a good quality education, you have no chance of rising in a society, no matter how hard you're working, no matter how smart you are. You're at a disadvantage, right? And so that they find that these things lead to white people seeing brown-skinned immigrants, when white people see brown-skinned immigrants in low-skill, low-prestige job, that increases even more the stereotyping and discrimination and racialization of brown-skinned Latinx by whites. It's a vicious cycle. So the discrimination leads to the low, poor outcomes, which then increases the discrimination. That's what we mean by a vicious cycle. And it also leads to when Latinx, brown-skinned Latinx experience that prejudice and discrimination, that is what seems to lead them to not choose white, to not self-identify as white, but rather that seems to push them to self-identify as Chicano, Afro-Latino, Black, Latinx, as opposed to white. Okay, because remember the question is racialization, right? You know, what identity, what race are people choosing? And we know that the first generation is, you know, we already know that sometimes they choose white and sometimes they use mestizo because of, you know, how race is conceived of in their country, right? But here we're adding another layer, and that is regardless of what they felt like in their country, when they come to the United States, if they experience discrimination, which is much more likely to happen to a browner skinned Latinx, that is often pushes them to a different identity. They no longer see themselves as white. They start seeing themselves, they start self-identifying as Latino, Latinx, brown, Chicano, Afro-Latino. I should have showed the studies, but the studies show that people who experience discrimination are significantly more likely to choose these labels, this identification, than to choose white. And you also see that, I don't know if you remember from the first workshop, I told you that many Asian Americans, when they first come to the country, identify as Chinese American, Filipino American, Indian American, Vietnamese American, right? But, and for many years they did that, but I think I told you that over the last couple years, because of the anti-Asian violence, you see a lot more Asians identifying as Asian American. And you see a lot more, their identity as Asian American is becoming more important, more salient than their identity as Korean American or Japanese American or Vietnamese American, because of that discrimination, because of that violence. You see, it's the same pattern. Oftentimes we choose our identity not just because of the concepts and ideas in our minds, but in reaction to the discrimination we face. And that is the fancy word that academics use for that is, they say that we negotiate and contest identity. It's a back and forth. And we look for strategies to get ahead in society. So some people may choose, some Latinx may choose to claim white identity, even if they're, number 4, light brown, remember on that thing? They may use that as a strategy to get ahead in American society. They get here and say, I'm seeing that, white people are privileged. Hey, I'm white, right? They'll claim white identity as a way to contest and negotiate identity. It's a strategy, survival strategy. Another survival strategy you see among some Latinx is distancing themselves from Blacks and Indigenous people. I'm not Black. I may look really dark, but I am not Black. I am Latino. Yep, you've seen those people, right? Or even people from Cape Verde. They're not Latino, but the people from Cape Verde are famous for that. They're darker than me, and they'll say, I am not Black, I'm Portuguese. Right? Or the Dominicans, some Dominicans, they'll embrace their indigenous identity. I'm Indio. I'm not Black, I'm Indio. That is a survival strategy. That's a strategy you're trying to negotiate. There's a lot of racism. It's a white supremacist that you are trying to negotiate that, and you're trying to do the best you can for yourself. On the other hand, there's other things you could do, and it depends on your situation. So notice that people who choose these ones are more likely to be lighter skinned. It's hard to claim, it'd be hard for me to, if I was Latinx, it'd be hard for me to claim white identity, right? And it also depends on where you are. It depends on a lot of things. But here's some other survival strategies. You could go the other way, especially people who are darker skinned, and especially people who have experienced discrimination are going to go in the other direction. They may choose as a survival strategy, they may choose to embrace their Afro-Latinx identity culture, Chicano, brown. I've seen even Puerto Ricans that to me, they look off-white to me, and they'll say, no, I'm Black, I'm Afro-Latino, I'm Black and proud. You know, they're negotiating, but it's in response to this discrimination, right? Or another one is social and political collaboration and community between Latinx and Black Americans. These are all different ways that Latinx people, aside from their conceptions of race, these are survival strategies that they will use, or to try to deal with the racism that they're facing, of trying to negotiate a white supremacist society, is by embracing different races, and by assimilating to different racial communities, or by collaborating and with and allying with different communities. And you can see that with how immigrants, first generation immigrants, versus their teen children identify. So you see the red is immigrant and the blue is their kids, second generation. You can see that the immigrants are first generation are much more likely to identify as white. But you see the teen children are much more likely to identify as, when they say nationality as race, it means like it was mostly Mexicans. So they would identify Mexican as a race, like Chicano, like that is my race. I am Chicano or Chicana. They're much more likely to define themselves as a Mexican or Latino. And we know that that's partly because the concept of race in the United States is very different from the concept of race in the countries that the parents are coming from. But we know that the other factor is the discrimination that they're facing in this country or growing up in. And you can also see it also depends on the place that they live in. Even if you control for ethnicity, you will see that identification as white or other changes dramatically depending on the place. So you can see that Latinx people of various ethnic backgrounds are much more likely to identify as other in California and in New York and New Jersey. These are places where they experience relatively less discrimination and where diversity, racial diversity, is more embraced. You notice that sometimes the people from the same origins, but in Texas and Florida, which are more racist and less accepting of diversity, they're much more likely to identify as white. This is an example of them, their strategies. They're choosing an identity that fits in order to, to best get by in their community. And I finished. So we saw that racism but the racialization of Latinx, like what Latinx race means to others, and what it means to, and how Latinx people self-identify and how they see themselves in relationship to other races. It depends on a whole layer of things. It depends on, it was partly because of ideas and concepts that were developed under Spanish colonial rule that were very different. The concept of race we saw in Latin America was very different from under Spanish colonial rule was very different than under British colonial rule. Remember, much more mixing and much more in between intermediary races, right? Whereas in Latin America, in British America, it was you were either Black, Indian or white. That's it. Very racial categories, boxes. Right? And then we saw that there was a layer on of other concepts of race after independence from Spain. We found out that the countries went in sort of two directions. The countries that had more whites, where whites didn't have to negotiate power, they set up whiteness ideologies. And in those countries, everybody wants to be white, like in Argentina, very racist. Whereas countries like Mexico and even Colombia, where the whites had to a coalition with the mestizos to win independence, they had to set up ideologies that was accepting of mestizos. And in fact, the mestizo was, at least in theory, is celebrated more than white, or at least they just don't talk about white. But we noticed that in both cases, Blacks and Indigenous people are still marginalized and discriminated against. So we can think of, in some ways, mestizaje is sort of kind of like a modification of white supremacy, right? And then, so we noticed that first generation Latinx are going to come in with very different conceptualizations of race, very different conceptualization of whiteness, and also even very different conceptualization of what skin color counts as white, right? And then in the next was American colonial rule. We learned that the United States really racialized Mexican Americans, first as a buffer race, but also really racialized the colonies, people of the colonies, which were Latinx, as Black, in order to rationalize and justify our colonialism. And we also learned that because of that, of the constant intervention of the United States into especially Central American countries, that created a lot of political and economic upheaval in Latin America, which is why so many immigrants come up, right? The reason why there's so much poverty in Latin America, it's not completely because of the United States, but the United States helped a lot. So in some ways, the United States is one of the reasons why there's immigration in the first place. And we also learned that not only does the United States create the conditions for mass immigration from those countries, but also they use political reasons to decide who to accept, what immigrants to accept, right? And in terms of racialization in the United States, we found that, first of all, particularly browner skinned immigrants, who tend to be also more low income, experience a much more anti-Latinx discrimination than lighter skinned. And some of the sources of the anti-Latinx discrimination are that idea that only whites can be real Americans, the colorism and that racialization of quote unquote illegality, even if you've been here, even if you've been a citizen for 2-3 centuries. And then we learned that creates a vicious cycle, because the discrimination leads to being in a low status position, which increases the discrimination, right? And last, we learned that Latinx, in addition to the different conceptions of race they have to choose how to respond to all of this discrimination. They have to respond to the discrimination, to the white supremacist society, and figure out how to, they have to negotiate it, right? They have to negotiate and push back and figure out where their place is and what's the best place to be. And we saw that some will choose to embrace whiteness as a way of trying to get ahead, and also anti-Blackness. And some will turn the other direction and embrace their more brownness or Afro-Latino-ness, or Chicano-ness, and embrace a community with Black. And of course, it depends lots of times on their situation, their skin color, how much discrimination they're getting, facing. Okay, so we're gonna do another 2-minute break. The reason why we deported the Mexicans, including Mexican Americans, was because of the Great Depression. So the idea was that there's no jobs. And so we need jobs for Americans, for real Americans. Okay, so now, remember I told you, I gave you heads up. I would like everybody to share their thoughts. Do me a favor, if you are just too overwhelmed to say anything, then just say that. Then just, you can just say, I'm gonna, I don't know, say that in any way you want to, but just so we know that you're not just choosing not to say anything.
Hi, Ayo, it's Onar. I was also monitoring the chat, and the one thing that I caught was when you were showing the immigration slides, there was like a lot of Honduran and Salvadoran in Louisiana, and we initially had that conversation. Also, a good percentage of Filipinos are in Louisiana. Can you talk more about that, of why Louisiana, the port, is so critical in terms of the different communities and population located?
I have no idea. I did not know that. That was one thing I just learned. So I'm guessing, Louisiana, of course, was a melting pot of everything, right?
Mm-hmm.
And of course, it's also, it's a port,
Mm-hmm.
right? So I'm guessing it's just a combination of that. I'm not sure why specifically Hondurans. I mean, in general, this is, it's lame, it's not specific to Hondurans, but in general, you see concentrations of immigrants in places all over the world, because once there's a small community there, of course, I don't know the reason why the first ones came, but of course, once a community gets set up, then of course, a lot of people follow, because they know, they'll have contacts there, they'll have a community there, people bring, and it grows. But I don't know specifically why Hondurans went there. That was news to me. Learned something.
Thank you. Thanks, Cynthia. Cynthia shared for Hondurans is a combination of violence in the country and diaspora building community in New Orleans area.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yep, we've learned a lot about construction of identity, construction of race. People like the cartoons. Cynthia, what does HSI stand for?
Hispanic Serving Institute. So our undergraduate student body is over 60% Latino identified. Right? It invites questions around what are their nuanced experiences? Where are they at in terms of identity development? What kind of supports or conversations or access to information do they need as opposed to this 60% group?
Got it. Thank you. Wendy, would you like to say something, share something?
Sure. Well, first, I wanted to thank you again for the awesome seminar. It was very good to see this. Like again, I've studied immigration a little bit, so like some of this is familiar in terms of like racial construction and immigration. But I think the thing for me that was really that stood out for me, I really like that chart you presented of like the parents versus the children and their identification with whiteness. But I think that's what's most interesting to me and resonates with me because I'm a child of immigrants, but also I think what that really brings up for me as well is like the challenges within the Latino community with like racism and colorism. And I think it is often, like you said, in terms of like negotiating your identity for survival, but like it's the tragic trap of like white supremacy overall that like in your attempt to protect yourself, you uphold the racial hierarchy and then you end up contributing to like systems that hurt people from your community as well as other communities. So I think I'm grappling and I'm still trying to make sense of it, but like I think this is an important context to take into account because of the students that we serve. Mm-hmm. So like if the students that we're serving are like, I think Cynthia posted like 60%, Latino, we know that a significant proportion of our undergrads are from working class backgrounds. Mm-hmm. We have a large undocumented population relative to other campuses too. And within the context where you're struggling financially, with your identity, and with discrimination, not just for you, but for your family, like, how do we think about supporting them so that they get to have these negotiations safely, but also without having to hurt other people? Mm-hmm. Because grappling with that part of it too is like really difficult as you get older and you learn and you realize like, oh my God, like how many people did I hurt because I was hurting, right? And so I don't know, these are just some things that like came up for me as like I think about our students and all of our efforts to improve like campus climate for them and for other groups of students like on our campus. So I think it's like a deep point of reflection for all of us. Like, what do we do to uphold the systems that oppress like different groups? How do those show up for the students? And what do we do to intervene on our own behalf, but also to kind of help them, give them the space to process this because they're young, because they're learning, and because they have to be able to process it like in a safe way so that they, are aware and can choose how they engage with the world around them as they, grow and learn. I don't know, just general thoughts.
No, great thoughts. And it's recorded, so you can use this recording. You're free to. Remember I told you, you guys are free to use the recording as much as you want during the year. So, maybe you could, if it's helpful, hopefully. And I wanted to point out that light-skinned Blacks also do the same. Light-skinned Blacks, biracial Blacks, and we also engage in colorism and
right.
and in anti-Black racism. And the same thing. You're trying to negotiate your own position. You're trying to improve your own position within the white supremacist society, but your strategy, unfortunately, involves reinforcing the system. And of course, I'll send you the PDF of the So you can look over, I'm responding to, some people were responding to interested in some of the graphs. So you can look at some of the graphs later on. And interesting, Jesus says, I have seen firsthand how third generation immigrants, Mexican descent, tend to do worse than the second generation. Thanks for pointing that. Interesting that you guys have observed that. There's lots. I love seeing all the different comments. Yeah, I love how it's so democratic. We're getting an overview of what so many people are thinking. I love this. But I'd like to open it up. It's also late. If you need to leave, you can leave. But if anybody would like to jump in, and we have so many different points that we could jump in on. So many different. Anybody want to comment on anything they're wondering, or also on all the wonderful comments? Onar, you might want to save this chat. It sounds like it'd be really interesting for you guys to discuss later on. So
Absolutely. Okay. Oof. Yeah. Hmm. Oops. Go ahead, Wendy.
Yeah, I was just wondering if Mariana, if she's still here, she would be open to discussing what she wrote in her post about, like racism and PTSD, like from an instructor perspective. I responded to her comment, but like, this is something that I grapple with on a regular basis of like, how do you contend with like intergenerational trauma of like, right, like my parents are from Central America, my dad lived through a war, like that is something that I carry in my lineage and like in my day to day, in addition to like the traumas that I carry with me from like my racialized experiences and having to deal with that as like a pretty fair-skinned Latina woman, right? Like compared to like my colleagues or friends, etc. Like somehow we're supposed to show up to work, show up to school, do our work, be productive, without anybody being able to acknowledge or recognize like everything that we bring to the table when we're in a room. So I wonder, I was just more curious about your approach and like if you were open to discussing it.
Yeah, well, I guess I read about this years ago when I was going through my own trauma, and someone told me like, oh, there's research being done that shows that trauma can be passed down genetically, and I was literally like, bullshit. But you know what? It seems like it is in fact not bullshit, and so that sucks. Number one, but number two, just getting to knowing that the students I have in front of me are so diverse and there could be like a million different flavors of trauma behind them. I don't want to treat them like victims, but I want to treat them with an understanding and a respect that's like, you know what, we're all humans and we all go through bad stuff sometimes. It doesn't mean that has to define us. So I've usually been very, very private about what I share with my students, and I've been trying to be just more vulnerable with them and letting them know, you know, hey, that happened to me too, or you know what I've done, like, yeah, because I think some, you know, students think teachers have it all together, and we really don't. And I've been doing an exercise recently, and I want to share it with this group. It was done anonymously. It's been something I've been doing with my students since the pandemic. I call it a vent session. And I use Google Docs. And I tell them just like, don't log in through your Gmail so you can be anonymous. And I typically delete these, but we've done one recently. So I think it's okay to share because it's not grades. It's not... can't identify any of the students, but sometimes, well, lately I've been making time in class regularly to just like, you know what, let's just make sure that we're all okay. My goodness, did I delete it? I don't think I did. I might have deleted it. Let me see. Oh no, here it is. Yeah, I guess if anyone who works with students, and by the way, I'm not sure how smart or safe this is, but if anyone wants to borrow it, I found that it's really effective, and I just let students work on the document for like 10, sometimes 15 minutes, and just talk about what's going on in their lives. And it's taken forever for the link to pop up. So I'll put it in the chat, and I won't delete it for a while if anyone wants to look at it, because these are freshman students and what they had to say about what's going on at midterm and stuff. And I just try to make it a positive thing and let students know like that I am a mandatory reporter. And if there's anything serious going on, that I hope they would reach out to me. But this is a place Just particularly because sometimes students I don't know, they just don't have the time or the forums to talk about what's going on. And they, at different stages in the semester, they end up having very similar experiences. One in particular is like homesickness. And at the same time, they're all like missing home, even though they really wanted to get out of there initially, or missing their families, like their food that they can get wherever they're from. So and students have reported that they like kind of having a break from the rigor of academia to just be like, hey, what's going on? And the opportunity to lift each other up anonymously. So that's what I've been doing.
Mhm.
I can speak from the Black community that what you're saying, the role of adults or the older people helping younger people explore the identity, and also that empathy with them, and well, I shouldn't say empathy, but just them knowing that as adults we've been through the same thing, that is essential. That's really key. Like they say it's at least for Blacks, whether they have a Black teacher, it plays a huge role in whether they graduate from high school, they go to college, all these factors, just even having one Black teacher. So I'm what do you call it? I'm supporting you. I'm backing you up. That's essential, what you're doing.
Thank you.
Also want to give this was amazing. This book was just really it was on fire, and it's not that thick. Unfortunately, it's hardback, but it's 2018, so I figure the paperback should be coming out relatively soon. But this gives you an idea of how on fire it is, and every page looks like that pretty much. And she's in the UC what do you call it, system. So maybe you can have her speak.
Thanks, Ayo.
So to the comment around, the adults being able to relate and understand our youth experiences, how do we intertwine that with some other conversations happening on campus around increasing the diversity of our faculty and staff?
Mhm.
How does that situate for y'all?
It's kind of hard to hear you, Cynthia. Can you repeat the question?
Yeah, I can take it off because there's no one around me. I think as the conversation around the adults and how they play a pivotal role in helping, and just saying, yes, I've been through that, I understand, how do we support one another? How do we situate that understanding with also the call around, we need to diversify our faculty and our staff? How are people situating our university context with the conversation at hand?
I guess I can chime in with my thoughts on this. I think it ties into what Mariana was just able to describe, her ability to be vulnerable with her students and say, right, this is what I've been through, and kind of normalize it to some extent. I mean, it's horrible. We shouldn't be normalizing. It shouldn't be normal to have this much trauma in your day to day. However, that is our reality, and I think to some extent, first of all, being able to see people that look like you at like a level you're not used to seeing that kind of representation, I think can go a long way, in the same way that Aya described the way that like, you know, darker skinned Latinos being in like, you know, certain positions and like labor markets exacerbates like racism. I think seeing more diverse representation at different levels can like at the very least make that like a possibility that somebody maybe never conceived before. In a way that like if you don't see people at those levels, then it doesn't occur to you that that could be a pathway for you if that's not what you're surrounded by. So like in those two ways, like I think there's a level of compassion that comes with like that lived experience.
Right.
In a way that I've experienced also, like my deepest, most traumatic experiences with racism didn't happen until I was an adult, right? And it's given me like this very visceral, nuanced and expansive understanding of like the very real impacts of racism, and how specifically in higher ed, how it is life or death for some people, right? And so our inability to intervene as an institution is life or death for some of the people that we serve, right? I wouldn't have known that because of my positionality prior to that and in the context that I was existing. So like as somebody who has like, from that position alone, like that level of very visceral understanding of a lived experience that's not dismissive, I think can go a long way as like an instructor, a chancellor, a high up administrator, you know.
Mm-hmm. Thanks for sharing, Wendy. I kind of, I want to add on to that, right? Like we always say representation matters, right? But truly, how do we go about that in diversifying folks who look like us, right? So my own experience is, it's always around whiteness, right? And then when folks started coming into my life and into my leadership position as a undergraduate, and those folks of color, right? Absolutely, representation matters, right? And I think Mariana is still here, right? Like when we look into this whole sector around education and classroom environment, like you are the elder, right? And how great would that be if the elder, as I see you, right, you have this worth of knowledge that you kind of turn it around and like, no, I want to check in with you, right? Like really, really in an authentic way. It's like, wait a minute. Whoa, that could really heighten the experience in the classroom itself, right? And that connection piece for different communities who look for that connection. And so, and again, I was waiting for this. I think it was early in the beginning of my own development by my favorite author, Ronald Takaki, Strangers from a Different Shore, right? Because when people ask you, where are you from? Well, what do you mean where I'm from, right? I'm from here, right? So because when you say from, whiteness, American, this and this, like that archetype, right? Because if you don't fit that, you're not from here. So in a way, it is troubling, right? And so I've been sitting in that, and people's comment, my gut dropped. So still in that process. A lot of stuff coming in. Mm-hmm. Thanks, Wendy.
Thank you.
Thanks, Sabrina.
Yeah, what Onar was saying about representation, that's I'm glad, thank you for saying that, because it's difficult for me sometimes because I'm really whitewashed. I see myself more as white than Latino or Filipino, because it's just all the language is gone, most of the culture is gone. There's this last name that I only recently found out where it came from. So I feel like I don't represent our students, but I'm still here. And that doesn't mean I just get to check out and pretend like all of this never happened, or even that I'm not a product of colonization. And that's why I'm like, I have no idea. I have a lot of missing information about myself. So the teacher as elder part, and I want to say that you were even just talking about just taking the time to see our students and letting them be who they are in our line of sight could maybe, I'm thinking back to the part of the lecture about how people who from places where they saw themselves as white come here and then no longer identify themselves as white because of the discrimination, the way that the view of the other, the impact the view of the other has on them. And so I'm just like wondering if, like, since we're pretty sure that's how it happens, then it makes sense that we could try to just reverse it, you know, like, okay, if I don't act discriminatory or don't come at my students with assumptions and see them, then maybe they'll be able to see themselves. I don't know if I'm not a philosopher. I'm way out of my depth here.
Please share. You're in good company.
I just want to clarify one thing, and I realize I said it a little bit misleading. In some cases, that person themselves will switch from calling themselves white to another, to, you know, other or Latino or Latinx or whatever. But oftentimes it's the kid, it's their kid that shifts. But first of all, because, you know, once you get your identity, it's hard for that to change in your same generation, and also because it's kids in high school that get exposed to those, and in they're more likely to speak English, they're more likely to be embedded in American society, and in high school they will get those messages, you know, in high school. So that's why you see it more with the kid, not just because of time, but also because they're more inserted into places where they're going to get those ideas, both the different ideas of race and also the discrimination. So sometimes it'll be in the same person, but often it's in their kid.
Thanks, Ayo.
Thanks for the clarification.
That's why you saw the big, you know, huge difference between parent and child.
Great. What about others? Anyone wanting to share? Unmute yourself, or I mean, again, this is a very this space is very different, y'all, right? There's a lot of engagement, so thank you for that. Again, I wasn't there last week, so I'm sure that that started it. But I'm excited for the next one. But again, I think as a collective, as we have been invested and you have been invested, which we really thank you for within our office, that we get to now shift, right? And as Alicia Garza say, that we gotta keep chipping away so we can create change. But again, when I say the collective, this is us, right? As we champion equity work in our own different arenas and finding the joy and the connections that we're making. But really would love to open it for those who we haven't heard from, or again, you still can pass, right? But we'd just love to hear other folks and comments of today. Okay. I have my notes open. Anyone else?
Would it be okay if I spoke about something that's not directly related to today's topic?
Of course, Naoko.
Yeah. Hi, thank you. So I was kind of curious, New York's decided to stop that gifted program that after they were found to be really racially discriminating. I was wondering
You're talking about the
what
admission schools? I'm trying to remember the admission schools.
the gifted program in schools, they decided to terminate it, is what I read in the news. And I was wondering if it's because they had disproportionately benefited the wealthier, whiter schools. I was just wondering would that be the best way? I mean, if that the reason why they're stopping was because it was discriminatory, is just getting rid of it the best thing they could do? I mean, they could have instead, focused the resources on the places that hadn't been getting it. So why are they just dropping it? And I was just curious what you thought of that.
In the ideal world, I mean, there's a reason why my organization is called Uprooting Inequity. In the ideal world, the best thing would be go to the roots, which would be, because the root of the problem is vast inequities in school funding and school quality. I am, for example, I'm not that crazy about affirmative action, not because I have anything against affirmative action in philosophy, but rather because to me, it doesn't make sense to wait till you're 18 years old. And then what you should do is the source of the problem, of course, is the vast inequities in K through 12. So ideally, I would say, of course, then again, why wait until you're 15 or however old they are when they go into the gifted program? We should have more equal funding. The problem is that's theory. In practice, white New Yorkers have been the lengths they have gone to monopolize high quality schools in public schools in New York City. It is just breathtaking. I mean, it's like when you study it, you're like, oh my God, this could be like a Harvard Business School study on strategy, right? Because I mean, it's just devious. I mean, it's like it just goes on and on. Like every time you try to change a policy, they'll do something to change it. Every time they try to. They'll try to create a school for low-income Black and Latino students. White parents will come in and take it away. It's just absolutely astounding. So I don't know how you could do that. In theory, yes, you should get better funding and better quality schools for all kids. That's in theory, but in practice, privileged white parents in New York City, like I said, it's like a master class in strategy. No matter what happens, they manage to just, what do you call it? Opportunity hoarding. They manage to hoard and take up all of the best education. And I don't know if you know, but it's the most extreme in New York City. New York City has by far the most racial school segregation in the entire country, and also the most hoarding of better school resources, K through 12 resources. I mean, it really is astounding. Like when you read it, you're like, this has got to be a novel, right? This can't be true, right?
I was just going to say, maybe you can write a book about this, because
no, there's tons of stuff.
There's symbol of liberty, it's like symbol of liberty and melting pot, all the stereotype, and there we go. The reality is this.
No, there's lots of stuff
Okay.
written on it, like Nice White Parents, that podcast. That's where I learned a lot of it. The whole Nice White Parents podcast is about that. That's and you can read the transcripts too. But that tells a lot about it. And there's reports. I mean, there's tons of stuff written. So there's also articles in the New York Times. Like even that's how I got introduced to Nicole Hannah-Jones, because she wrote several great articles on it about the segregation in DC, in New York schools. So everybody knows it, but it's very hard to stop, because when you have disproportionate access to power and resources and contacts and language, sometimes it's just language. So I would say in theory, yes, but in practice, there is no way. I don't know how in practice you could get better, more equal quality education so I would be forced, if I was a government person, I would be forced to do the same thing. I would say, yes, get rid of the gifted program, because your hands are tied. That's the only thing you can do. No matter what else you do, white parents will get around it. Wow. I hate to say that. I hope I don't sound horrible, but it's here. I'll just a minute. Nice White Parent. It's long. It's a series of 4 or 5 of them.
Thank you.
Well, let's see. Let me do it to everyone. There we go. It's a series of 4 or 5 of them, but it's pretty astounding. And also because gifted programs also have so much bias in general in them, that it would be one of the first things I would grab, because gifted programs are just infamous for being biased. There's controlled studies that show, like, for example, when they do, when they control for testing, they find that so many also gender, girls, Blacks, Latinos, English language learners, low income students, there's so many of them that have high IQs and don't get into the program.
Thank you very much.
Sorry, I don't know if that was the right answer, but
No, it's good to know. Maybe maybe everyone else knows, but I had no idea, so it was just shocking to me. Thank you very much.
Great. Thanks, Naoko. We have 1 minute until we're time, but again, thank you so much for staying with us. And again, we will send you an email for the upcoming, our 5th seminar with IO, and also an evaluation. Please fill that out as we are collecting data in terms of how we can incorporate the sessions, and also how we can continue these conversations. If you have any ideas, again, as thought partners and stakeholders to make our campus just a little bit more inviting and welcoming, and grounding ourselves with equity work, that we need each other. So please look out for that. And again, thank you so much for joining us. Ayo, again, thank you.
I really enjoyed the chat conversation. You guys were burning up the chat. I loved
Right?
it. It was amazing. I
I'm
hope
telling
you
you,
saved that chat, because it was on fire.
Right.
Yes, love that chat conversations. Thank you very much. And also, again, I want to just encourage you, if you want to do something with your students and with the community, feel free to use this recording, or parts of it. That's one of many options while you're out there being the elder.
All right. Thank you, everyone. And have a great rest of the week.